Well, hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about how the music industry, and not just the industry, but music artists themselves, fell out of love with cars because it was a very long and fruitful and seemingly mutually beneficial relationship. But then it ended. Oh, pardon me. And what sort of reminded me of this is there's an ad that's gone viral. It's for Jaguar, and the ad has gone viral because most people really don't like it. And many of the reasons they don't like it is because it's weird. It doesn't mention cars. It doesn't really mention anything at all, come to think of it. Doesn't show any pictures of cars, doesn't allude to cars. There's just sort of weird looking people doing weird sort of things in weird clothes, and it talks, and there's some sort of seemingly disconnected phrases about copy no one or something like that. It's weird. It's like an ad for a kind of trendy perfume if the perfume was trendy in 2007, that sort of thing. Now that this got me thinking. A lot of people have said that the ad is a product of an ad department at the car company that just is totally out of touch with the culture. And it is true that while not every car commercial used to be so solely factual, it does 0 to 60 in however many seconds, it has this much horsepower, it has this kind of suspension. I mean, there's some ads like that, and I kind of appreciate those because it's informational. But a lot of successful ads were all about aspiration, but they were about mainstream aspiration, not about weird avant-garde stuff. And in any case, this Jaguar ad is what a kind of normie would assume an avant-garde person does. So it fails even by that metric. Not that such people ever bought Jaguars. So it's just a failure at every level. But it got me thinking about how the aspirational nature of sports car or luxury car ownership used to have a really interesting relationship to the music industry. And it goes back a long way, but it definitely reached its peak in the 60s. In the 60s, rock and pop music were absolutely car crazy. And the kings, we've got to crown them, are the Beach Boys. When they weren't singing about surfing, they were singing about cars. They were singing about Deuce Coupes. They were singing about 409s. They were singing about Dodges. They were singing about Corvettes with fuel injection. They were singing about Thunderbirds. They were a one-stop shop. If they were, they could have been car dealers. Ronnie and the Daytonas had their wonderful song GTO, and the other sort of big California beach-centric group, Jan and Dean, all sorts of cars. There was Dead Man's Curve, Little Old Lady from Pasadena, Hey Little Cobra by the Ripcords. I mean, Hot Rod Lincoln was 72, but it harkened back to that era, and that was, of course, by Commander Cody and his Lost Planet Airmen. Of course, that would have been an early 70s, late 60s name for a band. SS396 about the wonderful Chevelles of the late 60s, or mid 60s rather, by Paul Revere and the Raiders, Mustang Sally, a Wilson Pickett classic. So obviously the 60s were spoiled for choice when it came to songs about cars, but there were plenty in the 70s as well. Joe Walsh talking about his Maserati doing 185, but he lost his license. Now I don't drive. Life's been good. One of the best songs ever. It's got the satire, it's got everything. Eric Clapton talking about Cadillacs and I've got a rock and roll heart. And of course, the very, very best song of all about cars, possibly of all time. And this is Highway Star by Deep Purple. Nobody gonna take my car. But there were so many lowrider about the lowrider culture that emerged in Southern California at this time. That was from 75. Radar Love by Golden Earring. I've been driving all night, my hands wet on the wheel. Great, great driving song. Life in the Fast Lane, not about a particular brand of car, but it's about the general lifestyle. Um, Yeah, lots of good stuff. And in the 80s, obviously, they were a band from the 70s, but they made it huge in the 80s. The Cars, and one of their songs was called Drive. Little Red Corvette by Prince, not about a Corvette, but hey, it's a name drop. It's a reference. Fast Car by Tracy Chapman. Yeah, it's a metaphor, but nevertheless, Bruce Springsteen, Pink Cadillac. Bruce liked his cars, so it seems Sammy Hagar, the king of 80s car songs at the very end of the 70s, Trans Am Highway Wonderland, but of course, that wonderful mid 80s classic, I Can't Drive 55. Uh, Again, along with Highway Star, one of the best, and the Beach Boys numbers, one of the best songs about cars of all time. So then what happened in the 90s? Because there was a steep drop off in references both to car companies, to driving in general. Um, Hold on, I need to turn this off. One second. Driving in general, the whole sort of thing. No hands wet on the wheel. No, not being able to drive 55. None of this stuff. So what happened? Well, several things happen. The first time that we really see a lot of interest in car songs was in the 50s. Not as big as the 60s, but hey, there was still a lot. Hot Rod Race by Archie Shelby and his Mountain Dew Boys, or Archie Shelby rather. Maybelline by Chuck Berry mentions both Fords and Cadillacs. Speedo by a group called the Cadillacs. So there you go. This song turned into an ad. See the USA in your Chevrolet. Before that, there was In My Merry Oldsmobile. So again, even though the 60s was this golden age, the 50s had car songs, the 40s had car songs. So what happened in the 1990s? A lot. Um, Cars became increasingly less interesting. And people could say, well, maybe that happened in the 70s with the cafe standards and the catalytic converters. But even though 70s cars in many cases lacked the muscle of their 60s predecessors, they made up for it in very unique appearance, in customizability. It was the Brome culture, and people still, did a lot of mods to their vehicles aftermarket. They still looked cool. I would argue that 70s cars looked even cooler than 60s cars, not in all cases, but in many's. A lot of 80s cars from the US looked very ugly, but many of the European ones looked absolutely gorgeous. Ferrari and Lamborghini were really designing some beauts in the 80s, so was Mercedes-Benz and BMW. Um, and Jaguar itself still going strong, but because they decided not to redesign most of their cars from the 70s and late 60s, but that was okay because they were very beautiful. So the 80s still had interesting cars. Pontiac was still doing some interesting things, as were Buick on the US side of things. But then in the 90s, things got a bit clinical. And there was this kind of divergence. There was this kind of divorce between the worlds of music and the worlds of automotive enthusiasts. And that has really never returned. There aren't that many songs about cars that really hit it big. Now, in the 90s, there was, of course, an exception, but people weren't talking about the cars of the day. They were talking about vintage cars. And this is of course, the 64 Impala, which became such a huge part of hip hop culture. And so while most of the songs referenced that vehicle and similar ones rather than actually wrote songs centered around the car, I still think that deserves a very honorable mention because by the time you get to the 2000s, even those kinds of references tend to drop off. The hip hop culture of the 80s and 90s was really big into the rear wheel drive, big block vehicles of the 60s and 70s. And even that sort of in the 2000s dried up as hip hop kind of lost its edge. So it's really interesting that Jaguar has attempted to make itself part of the culture, but just really failed because there's no car culture for them to latch onto. That's one of the problems. If this were the 60s, have a Beach Boy or a Beach Boy sound-alike band play in your commercial. If you're the 80s or 90s, have Sammy Hagar do it. If Chevy is going to sort of re-release a big rear-wheel drive Impala, have Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre do it. But there's no real cultural touchstone flagstones for a car company to do that with these days. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that it's not aspirational. Few people in the mainstream aspire to that very avant-garde lifestyle that's being promoted in the video. So that's problem number two. And problem number three, it's in an era where the culture isn't organically being driven towards the automotive world, didn't mean to do that, then it's going to be a bit of a stretch to do it. And some people might postulate that as climate change became a trendy, if you will, cause to take on board, car culture became less part of the pop culture. But look at all the electric cars that sell really well. And yes, some people say they're worse for the environment. Others say we don't like the guy who makes the best ones. But the point is, no matter if it's electric, no matter if it's naturally aspirated, turbocharged, or whatever, we have fallen in the music world out of love with cars. And I, for one, think that's a shame. But let me know what you think. And as always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.